Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Grace Benadu. We've been away for a few weeks, travel, other kinds of work, so glad to be back. On this episode, our focus will be on ancient Egypt, otherwise known as Kemet, and our focus will be a bit different perhaps than what you might think or might assume. You see, there are lots to be fascinated about ancient Egypt or Kemet that many people across the world, across time in fact, have been fascinated by this African civilization. And yes, the pyramids are astonishing and they still exist. They still are there. The writings, the monuments, the thought systems, the political structures and cultures and the histories make it so interesting for many of us. In fact, I came into the study of ancient Egypt, really the Nile Valley region, as an undergraduate in the latter part of the 90s. And, I was swept up in, the histories, but more curious about what I refer to as spiritual culture. That is the binding or combination of culture and spirituality, meaning they both reflect and sort of inform each other, sort of like something that's tightly braided, right? That's interwoven. And that kind of spiritual culture really fascinated me, really grabbed me as an undergraduate. I was less, enamored by the material culture, that is, the physical structures and monuments and other kinds of attention-grabbing features of ancient civilization in Nile Valley, particularly, in ancient Egypt or Kemet. But I was much more enthralled by that. Now, here's why. I want to share with you some of the features of that civilization that has gone unrecognizable, or in other words, that many of us have not, been privy to because we don't have perhaps the appropriate interpretation or are so basically unable to decipher, the meaning of what we see, though we have eyes. And so I want to get into some of those features that I've seen with my pair of eyes, a different set of eyes that may be interesting to you that perhaps you have not thought about or have viewed in the way that I'll share with you. So let's get right into it. So first, a bit of background, right? The civilization, the official sort of political history of ancient Egypt or Kemet, lasts close to 3,000 years. Right, so this is comparable to ancient China, which has a sort of unified history, though, of course, China's, like all civilizations, suffers invasions and therefore ruled by outside external forces, but unified in the sense that there is a largely unbroken chain of dynastic rule. By dynasties, we mean ruled by families that provide or supply a ruler or a king, and of course the whole royal court over a period of time, right? And so you have the dynasties, right, that are basically indigenous, local folks that set up this political order in ancient Egypt. Of course, what was key to that was a number of things. One, ecology, geography. You see, the Nile River in the ancient world is about 3,000 years ago, up until about the end of the BCE era, before the Common Era, and that ecology set it up for really what became the ancient Egypt that we all have this fascination with. And the reason is this, is that the Nile River used to inundate or flood almost 28 days to the T, that is the moon cycle, or for women, the menstrual cycle. And that particular lunar cycle, inundation would bring rich topsoil that would basically, when the river floods, it would actually push this rich black topsoil onto the landscapes around it. So when the river inundates or embank, it would pass the bank of the rivers on both sides and be able to feed it with this rich, nutrient-rich topsoil. And some argue that the name Kemet refers to people of the black soil, or some people, the land of the black people, whichever way you want to toss it. It sort of equals the same difference. Nonetheless, that topsoil then becomes key, because what you have in the earliest period, which Egyptologists and historians of that earlier period refer to as the archaic period, and for simplicity, we'll stick with them just for those who don't have the sort of deeper background. That's when farmers begin to basically set up the civilization. There's a formula that I like to work with. I think is convenient and very helpful, which is that you can't have culture without agriculture. In other words, agriculture supplies for surplus. When the rich topsoil, provides for this fertile growth in crops, then people can store grains like rice or millet or sorghum, other kinds of crops, which they can then use over the periods of famine and drought, or I should say drought and famine, though famine has other causes than drought. Nonetheless, that sort of setting aside surplus allows people to engage in philosophy or the arts or spiritual practice that they wouldn't otherwise. Essentially, if you're too preoccupied by the rumblings in your tummy, you're not going to think about philosophizing or spiritualizing, which is a word I made up, and I'm allowed to make up 2 words per episode, or engage in these other activities, right? If you're preoccupied with feeding your stomach. And so agriculture provides for cultural development. That happens with these group of farmers. Of course, once you have this attractive society, then you begin to what? Pull like a magnet other folks from the south, in what is now Kenya and parts of Ethiopia, that is the western part of Ethiopia, into even parts of Uganda, contemporary Uganda, that is, from the 2 rivers that lead into the Nile proper, which is the Blue Nile that takes its origin with the Atabar River in the Ethiopian highlands to the east. And of course, further south would be the White Nile that runs from Uganda. And so these 2 Niles flood into the Nile proper, which of course ultimately drains into the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile Delta. So along this pathway, you have these migrants, right, that are coming from also from the west as well, before the Sahara Desert dried up. And all these farmers begin to what? Create culture, create the societies and the rules thereof. And so in the first sort of the old kingdom, as it's called by Egyptologists, that's when you have the centralized rule and authority, or decentralized rule under some dynasties. But what happens is that in the old kingdom is that there is a sort of dissolution, of the monarchy due to internal strife and social unrest. And that leads to a number of reforms that pushes from centralization towards a little more decentralized rule into these provinces and districts, where people begin to essentially have these local rulers, regional rulers that are under, the ruler or Nawis, which would be the ruler or king of ancient Kemet. And one of the key features that comes out of this old kingdom, that for our purposes here, what fascinates me so much, is that there is an emphasis on social justice or reform. That is, there's more emphasis on compassion, emphasis on mercy, emphasis on the moral responsibilities that leaders and rulers at the district, provincial, and state level have towards their citizenry, right? And my guess is that it's in this period that the virtue and value of Ma'at, which roughly, represents these ideals of truth and reciprocity, balance, right, justice and order, right, begins to become institutionalized. I'm not saying this is the time when those virtues are, created, but at least they become institutionalized. And out of that, of course, these virtues begin to, of course, run its course through the so-called Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, of course. And by then, by 1000 BCE, the Persians invade. They set up their own rule. By 500, the Greeks invade. They set up their own rule. And of course, by 300, the Greeks, and then by 30 BC, the Romans take over. And of course, that becomes a different sort of civilization under these foreign occupiers, right? And so in this sort of broad sweep, because it's not meant to be a history of ancient Egypt, but I want to give you at least enough background to work with. And so, through that period, there are these moments of instability, right, that usually usher in periods of central authority reestablishing itself with stability. Then instability, and usually these periods of instability are marked by decline in trade, which makes sense because people are less likely to trade if there's social unrest and instability. And during periods of central authority, there's what? Expansion in what? Statue, pyramid, other kinds of large constructions, as well as increase in trade, and even what? Wars with other territories where Egypt becomes a colonizer and occupier, from their vantage point, right? And so you find this sort of seesaw or teetering between these two when there's order, right? That is the virtue of Ma'at. And then there's Isfet or chaos, which is invasion, decline of central authority, loss of trade or decline in trade, and therefore what? Resources are tight. There's social unrest. That's marked by this chaos. And these two principles, not only cultural principles, they're spiritual principles, right? And that, you see, Ma'at is not only a philosophical, but it's a cultural and spiritual bedrock of society, right? Which is to sort of essentially, whenever there is the inkling or there's a tendency for chaos or disorder, the virtues are supposed to what? Stand up, or the people that are responsible for maintaining the virtues, that is the so-called priesthood and the political authorities, are supposed to what? Stand on those virtues, back those virtues, essentially make the rule of justice and order and truth surpass the gravitational pull of chaos, social unrest, and disorder, right? And so what I'm arguing here is sort of a different reading of the history and culture of ancient Egypt in short order, because we don't spend much time in this video, is that really the seesaw or the ebb and flow of that 3,000 years of generally unified political and cultural history can boil down to this, pull and struggle between order, truth and justice, and disorder, chaos, and social dissolution, right? And it is the responsibility of the spiritual and political leaders to effect what? Enact, stand by, and stand up for those virtues that we attribute to the divinity, but also the principles of Ma'at, right? Which again is a spiritual principle at its core. You see, ancient Kemet was divided into these nomes or localities, and each nome, had a particular divinity that was the sort of not the head, but the representation of that particular locality, right? And these divine forces, referred to as Nechu or Nechu in plural, they in fact, would be the sort of central point of contact, of refuge, of restoration of this idea of order and balance, right? Of mercy, of compassion, especially between the rulers and the ruled. And when that social contract, that spiritual contract broke down, it led to what? Internal strife, corruption, other kinds of behaviors that allow for what? Invasions. For example, invasions from the Hyksos, the so-called group of people that are generally undifferentiated from Western Asia. And of course, later invasions from the Persians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans, and of course the Arabs in the 7th century of the Common Era, right? But those invasions, and it's the key takeaway, one of the key takeaways, are not plausible or as successful if there isn't what? Internal social chaos and unrest, and people not living up to those values and principles of Ma'at, right? And so in a spiritual way of thinking about, in a spiritual way of thinking about, the history and cultural development of ancient Egypt, it gives us a really frame of reference for our own lives, because we teeter between those two forces, right? We have this sort of truth and untruth that we battle with, inside and outside. We have this, pull for having order in our lives, dealing with the force of what? Disorder and chaos. Whether it's this political season of uncertainty, and of course there is a what? Striving for certainty, right? In a world of uncertainty. There's also striving for a sense of spiritual balance with a world that will probably care less about spirituality because it's not at its core a public-facing, money-generating, status-gaining enterprise, right? It's really a humble and deeply personal undertaking between you and your creator, right? And so those tensions that characterize a civilization also typifies we as individuals, as members of families and members of communities. And what went for them also goes for us. So what are some takeaways? First key takeaway here is that the attempt at balance is more important than actually getting balance. What do I mean by that? You see, balance is not a destination. It's not an event that you simply, complete and get your prize. It's not a raffle. It's not a finish line that you reach. It is an ongoing thing that you strive for, with the very possibility that you may not get it, but the striving for it, it's what's key, right? Second takeaway is that what is true sort of axiomatically in terms of values and principles for society is also true for the communities and families and individuals that are part of that society. So what was true for ancient Egypt or Kemet is also true for our world and our societies wherever you may live in this world today. We all deal with, again, these tensions between our personal strivings of ambition and that of the people around us, the society around us, and the forces and figures that either support or deny or undermine, those very existence and very principles, right? Third takeaway is that a study of ancient Egyptian civilization is super fascinating. I've only scratched the surface. So, for example, to give you an appetizer, perhaps another episode, or we dig deeper, notice the figures, whether statues or on these papyri, which is the parchment that was used to write, or on the walls of these temples and burial chambers. You will find that you have figures that have heads or upper bodies of animals, whether they are jackals, they are crocodiles, they are different birds, for example, the Bennu bird or other kinds of birds, or falcons, cows. And what the ancient Egyptian folks, right, in that African civilization show us, they had a higher attainment of spiritual development, therefore development as a full or fuller human being than we do, because they show us what we really look like. In other words, if we were to cut off and take away or just to evaporate, these flesh and bones, you would look more like what you see in those statues and images. You will be a composite of animal and human, right? You would be. And so they show us how we really look, how we really appear in a visual form that no other civilization, actually few other civilizations have done with such clarity and with such detail. Because when you read some of the literature, for example, there's a book referred to as the Book of the Dead, which of course is a misnomer. There's a translation by a former British museum figure, Ewald's Budge. It's called The Book of Coming Forth by Day. And this book is available in translation. It's a dubious translation, as all translations are, because there's no one to say, this is how we really spoke, this is what we really thought, this is what our language really meant. The ancient language, of course, we don't have any present or contemporary people that actually read, speak, and write the language. And so we don't really know for sure, but based upon what we can decipher, that particular text, Book of Coming for a Day, gives us a lot to chew over. And those figures that you see, whether in statues or on the walls in papyri, really show us how we really look as spiritual beings without the physical human clothing, right? So there's lots more that we can delve into, but I'll stop this video here for now to let you digest that, chew on it, and perhaps we'll do another episode to follow up if there's interest. Please drop your questions and comments below, or your experiences and thoughts. Until next time, stay well.